Right now, the United States and Russia together hold approximately 11,000 nuclear warheads. That is 90% of the entire world's total. About 1,800 of those are on what's called launch ready alert, meaning they could be in the air within minutes of an order being given. That number has been sitting in the background for everyone long since before the Cold War, and nobody really worries about it these days because the assumption underneath all of it is that if it ever really did actually happen, none of it would matter anyway. You'd be dead, and so would everyone else. End of story. In the days since the Cold War crisis, though, nuclear fears have become background thoughts. But with the rising tensions in Ukraine, and now with the Middle East, those fears are once again making their way back into people's minds. But people still assume if anything did ever happen, everything and everyone would just be gone. That assumption is actually quite wrong, and I don't mean wrong in a look at the bright side kind of way either. I mean wrong in a very specific, documented, scientifically verified sense, where the actual data says something completely different from what most people believe, and where that gap between what most people think and what's actually true could be the difference between whether you make it or not. So today, we are going to do what nobody else in this conversation ever actually does. We are going to look at the real science and answer the question honestly. Could you actually survive a nuclear war? The answer is complicated, hopeful, and far more disturbing than you've ever been told. Now, before you go scaring yourself and locking away in a fallout bunker somewhere, let's get some facts straight. The everyone dies assumption didn't come from nowhere. It came from decades of Cold War culture, movies, television, public messaging, that was specifically designed around the idea of total, unsurvivable annihilation. War games, the day after, threads, these aren't just entertainment, they were cultural artifacts of a very specific political moment, when the dominant strategy on both sides was mutually assured destruction, or MAD for short. And the message, intentional or not, was that nuclear war had no survivors for any side. The science was actually genuinely terrifying for everyone. Carl Sagan's nuclear winter hypothesis in the 1980s suggested that the soot and debris from the large-scale nuclear exchanges could block out sunlight globally for years, collapsing agriculture and killing billions through starvation even in countries that were never directly targeted. That work was serious, it was peer-reviewed and very influential. It actually shaped public perception deeply. But here's what got lost in translation between the science and the cultural story. The everyone dies scenario requires a very specific scale of exchange, a full nuclear exchange between countries. Every warhead, every city, and a maximum yield is genuinely civilization scale catastrophic. Nobody is arguing otherwise. But that is not the only scenario on the table, not even the most likely scenario. And the survivability picture changes dramatically depending on the scale, location, and what you do in the first hours. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has published detailed nuclear survival guides. The Department of Homeland Security has also published it. These are not fringe prepper documents. These are official government agencies telling you with specificity that survival is possible and that your behavior in the first 24 hours matters enormously. The question is whether you know what to actually do, and most of people who think they know are wrong 9 times out of 10. Now, before we can talk about surviving one, we need to understand what we're actually dealing with here, because the term nuclear bomb is doing a lot of heavy lifting as a phrase, and the reality is more specific and much more survivable than the phrase implies. A nuclear detonation produces several distinct effects, and they are not all equally dangerous at the same distances. Understanding which threat you're facing at any given moment is most important. The first and most immediate is the blast wave. This is the shock wave of overpressure that radiates outward from the detonation point at supersonic speed. For a 1 megaton warhead, a large but not exceptional weapon, the lethal blast radius, the zone where the overpressure alone will kill you or destroy reinforced structures, extends to roughly 5 miles from ground zero. That sounds enormous, and it is. But it also means that beyond 5 miles from the center of the blast with that size, the blast wave itself is no longer immediately lethal. It will still shatter windows, knock down door frames, and cause serious injury out to much greater distances. But the physics of a pressure wave dissipating over distance means that survivability outside the immediate blast zone is a real possibility. The second effect is thermal radiation, the intense flash of heat and light released at detonation. This is what causes burns and blindness and fires across a much wider radius than the blast. The thermal pulse from a 1 megaton warhead can cause third-degree burns out to roughly 12 miles from the original detonation point in clear weather and can ignite fires across an even wider area. This is very serious, but again, it requires a direct line of sight. If you are inside of a building, in a car with windows away from the flash, or even behind any substantial structure at the moment of detonation, the thermal pulse is dramatically reduced. Distance and barriers actually matter, even when talking about a nuclear blast. Let's be honest for a second, though, that not all of these measures are foolproof. They are just measures to help you along. The third effect, and the one that most people wildly misunderstand, is radiation, specifically fallout. And this is where the biggest gap between public knowledge and actual science lives. When most people think about nuclear radiation danger, they imagine it as this invisible, everywhere, and permanent contamination that makes survival impossible and the land uninhabitable for centuries. That's a very big distortion. It's not entirely wrong for ground zero, but it's deeply wrong for how fallout actually behaves at distance. And getting this wrong could kill you when the correct behavior could actually save your life. Here's what actually happens when a nuclear weapon detonates near or on the ground, as opposed to an airburst, which produces less fallout. It vaporizes enormous quantities of soil, debris, and building material along with the weapon itself. That material gets sucked up into the mushroom cloud, irradiated, and then falls back to the earth downwind of the detonation. That's fallout. It's essentially radioactive dust and particles, and it is genuinely deadly in high enough concentrations. But here's the critical piece of physics that changes everything. Fallout radiation intensity drops off dramatically and rapidly with time. The rule that emergency planners work with is called the 7-10 rule. For every 7-fold increase in time after the detonation, the radiation intensity decreases by a factor of 10. What that means for us normal people without all the funny math is that fallout that is lethally intense 1 hour after detonation is roughly 1% as intense 2 days later. The most dangerous window is the first 24 to 48 hours. After 72 hours, the radiation level in most fallout zones has dropped to a fraction of its peak. After 2 weeks, most areas outside the immediate blast zone have dropped to levels that allow limited outdoor exposure. This is documented, published, official government guidance. FEMA themselves specifically says that sheltering in place for a minimum of 24 hours, ideally 48 to 72, in a substantial structure dramatically increases survival odds for people in fallout zones who are outside the immediate blast radius. The physics are not in dispute. What kills people most in the fallout window is not understanding this and doing the wrong thing. And the wrong thing has a name. It's called evacuation. This is the part of the video that I think is most important and least understood, so I want to be very clear about this. After a nuclear detonation, the instinct for almost everyone who survives the initial blast is to get out. Get in the car, drive away from the city, get as far as possible, as fast as possible. It feels right for most people, and it is the same instinct that works in almost every other emergency: fires, floods, hurricane. Move away from the danger in a nuclear scenario with active fallout. This instinct will kill you more reliably than the fallout itself. Here's why. When you get in your car and start driving, you are in a thin metal shell with no shielding value against gamma radiation. You are moving through the fallout zone rather than waiting for the radiation to decay. You are joining millions of other people doing the same exact thing you are, which means you are sitting in gridlock traffic, exposed in the open for hours at a time during the most dangerous radiation window. The car that feels like the escape is actually one of the worst places for you to be in a fallout event and actually feels more like a coffin. The correct behavior, counterintuitively, and very hard to make yourself do, is to go inside the most substantial building available and stay there, not because radiation can't penetrate the building at all, but because it penetrates much less. The shielding factor of different building types has been studied extensively. A wood frame house cuts your radiation exposure roughly in half compared to being outside. A brick or concrete building cuts it by a factor of 10. A basement in a brick or concrete building cuts it by a factor of 200. You are not trying to achieve zero radiation exposure. You are trying to reduce your dose below the threshold where it would give you acute radiation sickness. The people who understand this in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and survived were almost universally the ones who were inside substantial structures. The people who tried to run generally fared worse. We have data on this. It is not just theoretical. Now we have to talk about the uncomfortable geography of all of this, because survivability is not uniform, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Nuclear targeting doctrine in both the United States and Russia is built around a priority hierarchy. Strategic military assets, ICBM fields, submarine bases, command and control facilities, Air Force bases are the primary targets in a counterforce exchange. Major population centers and industrial infrastructure are secondary targets. In a limited exchange, you might only see the first category. In a full strategic exchange, however, you'd probably see both. The practical implication of this is that where you live right now is the single biggest variable in your personal survival odds. If you are within the blast radius of a primary target, and in the United States, that means places like North Dakota, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the areas around major naval bases, your survivability in a direct nuclear strike scenario is genuinely pretty low. The physics of being within 5 miles of a 1 megaton ground burst are not very forgiving. But the majority of the American population does not live at primary targets. Most people are in the cities or suburbs that are secondary or even beyond targets, and in a limited exchange, possibly not targets at all. For those people, the fallout scenario is the most relevant one, not the direct blast scenario. And for those people, the science says clearly that shelter, time, and correct behavior are the difference between life and death. The maps are public. The Federation of American Scientists, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the multiple academic institutions have published detailed targeting analysis and blast radius maps for the US cities. You can look up your zip code anytime you want. Knowing whether you are likely in a blast zone, a fallout zone, or neither is information that is freely available and that almost nobody has actually gone and looked at. Let's bring this back to the current moment, because this is not a Cold War thought experiment anymore. It is an active consideration in ways that it hasn't been since 1983. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022 introduced something that had been largely absent from geopolitical risk calculations for 30 years. A nuclear-armed state engaged in a conventional war with explicit nuclear threats as a diplomatic instrument. The Russian doctrine, which they have not been quiet about, includes the use of tactical nuclear weapons if the state perceives an existential threat. Whether that threshold has been deliberately kept ambiguous is itself a strategic calculation. The current nuclear risk assessment for organizations that track this professionally, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, moved their doomsday clock to 90 seconds to midnight in 2023. The closest it's ever been is not that a full strategic exchange is imminent, it is just possible that a limited tactical nuclear use is higher than at any point in the post-Cold War era. A practical nuclear weapon yields in the range of the Hiroshima bomb or smaller, used on a battlefield rather than a population center, produces a fundamentally different survival scenario than a full strategic exchange. The fallout is more localized, the blast radius is smaller, and the survival window in nearby populations is real. None of this is to minimize the real-world stakes. It is to say that the scenario that is actually elevated right now is one where correct knowledge and correct behavior might play more of a factor in the everyone dies scenario than people have in their heads. So let's be practical for a moment, because all of this science is only useful if it's translated into something actionable. If you are not in the immediate blast zone and you see or hear a nuclear detonation, the single most important thing you can do in the first 60 seconds is to get inside. Not run, not drive, but get inside the most substantial structure available, and get as far from the exterior walls and roof as possible. The center of a concrete or brick building, ideally in a basement or interior room, is where you want to be. You are trying to put as much mass as possible between you and the sky. Once inside, you stay inside for a minimum of 24 hours. 48 is much better. 72 is the point at which most fallout zones have decayed to a fraction of their peak radiation levels. During this window, you are not going to go outside to check on things. You are not going to drive anywhere not evacuating unless you receive specific official guidance telling you a clear evacuation route is open and the fallout pattern makes movement safe. You want to seal the building as much as humanly possible. Windows, door gaps, ventilation systems if you can reach them. Not because this achieves perfect isolation, but because reducing the amount of fallout particles that enter the building reduces your inhalation dose, which is a separate and significant exposure pathway from external gamma radiation. Potassium iodine, or Ki tablets, are worth having, but they do one specific thing. They saturate the thyroid gland with a stable iodine so that the radioactive iodine 131, one of the fission products in a fallout, cannot be absorbed by the thyroid. They do not protect against general radiation exposure. They do not make you radiation proof. They are one very specific tool for one very specific risk. And the people's understanding of what they do is almost universally wrong. Water and food that are sealed indoors before the detonation are safe to consume. Tap water from the municipal water system that was running before the event is generally safe. Food from sealed containers is safe. The contamination risk is from fallout particles that have physically settled on or in things, not from radiation passing through packaging and radiating contents, which is not how that works. So, could you actually survive a nuclear war? The honest answer is, it really depends on a set of variables, and some of them you have far more control over than you think. If you are within the direct blast radius of a targeted strike, which for the largest weapons means within about 5 miles of ground zero, the physics are against you in a way that preparation can't fully overcome. That much is sadly true. If you are outside the blast radius, but in a fallout zone, which describes the majority of people in countries that would be involved in a nuclear exchange, your survival is genuinely possible. And it depends almost entirely on whether you know what to do and whether you can make yourself do it when every instinct is pulling you in the wrong direction. The decision to evacuate or shelter, the decision to get inside immediately rather than watching from outside, the decision to wait 48 hours rather than getting in the car after 6. These are decisions that separate the people in historical nuclear events who survive in zones that should have been killed from the ones who didn't. The physics don't care about your instincts, they respond to mass and time. And understanding that is the whole game. The current situations right now are not a drill. The people running these governments know the same physics, and some of the most important decisions in human history may very well hinge on whether people on both sides believe that the other side believes nuclear war is survivable enough to be a rational option, because that belief is actually a deterrent in itself. Understanding what you're dealing with is not paranoia, it's the bare minimum. The government survival guides are real and they are free. FEMA's Nuclear Explosion Preparedness page is publicly available. The Federation of American Scientists has published blast radius tools you can use for any US city. If this video changed how you think about this, drop a comment. The algorithm pays attention to that, and it helps our channel grow. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of breakdown, and until next time, guys, stay happy and stay safe.